I'm Eric Keating. I'm going to be talking about product-led growth metrics today. So, like I said, today we're going to be talking about product-led growth metrics. And we're going to cover the most important product-led growth metrics and reference a couple of frameworks that help put them into context, which I think is something that's really lacking out there up until recently. So when we're talking about modern SaaS metrics, I'd be pretty crazy not to start with the Pyrometrics framework. So the Pyrometrics first developed and presented by Dave McClure back in 2007 as a framework for startup growth. And if you're unfamiliar with the metrics, you might be thinking, what's with the pirate reference? So the framework is acquisition, activation, retention, referral, revenue. Ultimately, R, like a pirate. So that's what it is. I'm going to assume we all know the basic meanings of acquisition, retention, and revenue. But activation may not be so clear. And the truth is, it's not as straightforward as some of the others. So before I dig in, actually, it's worth noting that you might know activation by other terms like aha moment or value realization. Essentially, a user activates when they first realize the value of your product, or they have their aha moment. It really clicks for them; they get it, right? And we'll dive into activation a bit more later in the deck. The other one is referral, so a bit more straightforward, but for clarity, this is about your users referring or inviting other users to use your product. In PLG terms, you may be used to hearing this one as it relates to the virality of your product or how well it motivates users to tell their friends and get them involved. My take on Pyrometrics, just a little bit different. I think in the age of product-led growth, it makes a little sense to reorder them, right? So while I'm sure Dave didn't super consciously put revenue last, I think it's a little more helpful in this order. And plus, I think it's a nice lead into my next topic too. So, I moved revenue from the last star to the first star. So especially in businesses that have a free trial or freemium model, revenue is typically first recognized when a free user converts into a paying user, right? So if you think about it, you acquire them, you activate, get them to pay you, etc. And it also places referral last, which may not be true for every business, but I think it's a little bit more broadly applicable. So whereas a product like Slack would probably place referral as an early step in the process due to their business model, most SaaS businesses aren't like Slack, right? And so more often than not, referrals represented in the form of reviews and case studies and testimonials, general word of mouth, which more commonly occur when a user has not only started paying, but also has had some kind of success with the product, right? So with this slight tweak, we started thinking about how we need a more visual framework for metrics like these, and one that really leans into the product-led model, right? One that links metrics like these to the user experience, and it makes it clear that happy and successful users actually influence new user acquisition. And so this is exactly why we worked with hundreds of businesses from startups to the Fortune 500 to develop the product-led growth flywheel. Ultimately, it's a framework for thinking strategically about the life cycle of every user of your product and meeting and exceeding their expectations at each stage of their journey. And when you do it right, you're not only going to increase user satisfaction and retention, but you're also going to increase customer advocacy, which, as I talked about, can be a hugely effective source of new user acquisition. So I'm going to dive into the flywheel a little bit. So to start, quick take on evaluators. So these folks are new or free users, no prior experience with your product. They're cautiously excited. They think your product might be able to solve their problems, but they're probably evaluating a variety of solutions, including all of your competitors. So the key here is to remember, like with few exceptions, each user entered your product looking to solve a specific problem. So exposing them to every nook and cranny is rarely the right strategy for how you bring people into your product and shape their initial experience. Instead, you really want to focus on driving them to the moment that's going to make them say, aha, right? Which is the aha moment or the moment of activation. So next we're going to talk about beginners and driving adoption. So these folks have activated, they've hit the activation moment. They're eager to learn more. They're starting to explore your product's other features and functionality a bit more deeply. And so what you want to do here is help them build on foundational knowledge and discover additional features and provide best practices for them. And what adoption looks like, right? So similar process with activation, right? You're going to want to do a bit of research. This one can be a bit more data oriented. you're really just trying to establish some guidelines for what normal, healthy usage of your product looks like. So, look at your users that kind of fit that mold generally, right? The people who have stuck around for a while, they're getting value out of your product. Maybe they haven't, shouted from the rooftops about how much they love it, but these are people who seem to be pretty normal users, getting value, feeling good about your product. How often are these people logging in? What features are they using, or what percentage of your product's features are they using? Does that depend on the user's function in a company or their role within their team? Ask these types of questions, and once you get some answers, establish some benchmarks, and you'll be able to categorize regular users using that criteria. Once you've established, or once your users have established a bit of a routine, right? They're logging in regularly, they're getting some value out of it. You know, they're going to become regulars in this framework. And so just like a customer that walks into a coffee shop and doesn't even have to order, right? It's sitting on the table, that's what their experience should feel like. Um, you know, at this point, your goal with these folks should be to really delight them and expand their usage even more, right? So expose them to new and premium features, and not just as a monetization opportunity for your company, but also as a way to deliver even more value to the user. Also, you want to be asking these folks for feedback, and that's ultimately how you're going to be able to measure their adoration of your product. So, this is a bit simpler than the others. For my team here at Appcues, it's when a user gives us a 9 or a 10 NPS score, right? They're a net promoter. And what we know when they give us that score is they have quantified their love for us or their willingness to refer us to a friend. And that's what we use to measure their love for our company and ultimately move them into the final stage of the life cycle here, which are champions. And so champions, these are the users who, they love your product. They're highly likely to recommend your product to colleagues, friends, social media followers. And more importantly, they've formed like an emotional connection with your brand and your product. And at this point in the relationship, you are providing value outside of the job to be done, right? They're probably wearing your brand's t-shirt on a weekly basis. And so your goal at this stage is to get your champions to actually advocate for your product, right? Highly likely to anyway, but you can drive that, you can really bring it home. And so advocacy, it could take the form of referrals, whether that be introducing your product to other internal teams within the organization or referring your product to somebody in their network. But you don't need a formal referral program for that to happen. It all happens without us vendors even knowing about it all the time. After all, word of mouth is the absolute best marketing there is, or the death of your business if it's bad word of mouth, right? At Appcues, we start we start by asking for public reviews and ratings, right? Sites like G2 and Capterra, they're generating millions of visits each month from our prospects looking for some kind of third-party user validation, right? And so this is also your prime segment for securing case studies and testimonials. So this group of people, the idea here is driving that advocacy, making sure it's public. And once you've got it humming, I assure you, you're going to start to see your CAC come down, your cost of acquisition come down, and your new user volume scale. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up on the flywheel and move on to some other metrics that any product-led business should be thinking about. First, time to value. So, how long does it take for a new user to reach their activation moment? It's pretty straightforward. Your goal is to minimize the amount of time it takes to get to the activation moment. The faster you get somebody to that point where they're realizing the value, the higher likelihood they are going to be successful and stick around for the long term with your product. Next, we're going to talk about product qualified leads. So, there are entire presentations dedicated to PQLs, so I'm not going to dwell on it. But the idea is that at some point, for some businesses, it makes sense to pass a user to the sales team. Could be to close the initial sale, or could be to capitalize on an expansion opportunity. And that's where, in really pure, exemplary product-led businesses, sales teams are often used to capture expansion opportunity. So PQLs usually defined by a combination of some user attributes and behaviors. For example, many businesses use the activation moment as a trigger to send a PQL to their sales team. So a free user activates, they're ready for a sales conversation. Speaking of expansion, so expansion revenue is hugely important to any healthy SaaS business. So while we're all, experience some degree of churn, the best businesses are growing because their existing customers are investing more dollars. Expansion revenue, net new revenue from existing customers after the initial sale, right? So you've got somebody that comes in, uh, at a base level tier, and ultimately, in order to get the value that they really want to, they've realized the value of the intro tier. They want to increase that value or get new and additional features. This is an expansion opportunity. There's potential for them to upgrade into that tier, and that's what uh, we categorize it as expansion revenue. Next, net revenue churn. So, like I said, expansion revenue, it's the anti-churn, right? So net revenue churn is calculated as total revenue lost to churn minus total new expansion revenue over revenue at the beginning of the period. So, for example, I think this math works. Your company has $1,000 in revenue at the beginning of the period, hopefully more than that. For example, $1,000 in revenue, you lose 100 to churn, but you make 200 in expansion revenue. So the net there is $100 from your existing customer base. And with the expansion revenue in that case, neutralizing the revenue that you churned. So your net revenue churn will be negative 10%. This is what you'd call net negative retention. And if you can, build a business that has a net negative retention, I promise you, it is going to be a successful business and very attractive to future investors if you are taking the VC path. Last one, not the least one, virality. So there's actually a formula and a metric for this, right? So basically you establish an average number of new users that an existing user can expect to bring on board and convert into a customer. So like I said a couple of times here, virality, whether it is actually inviting a new user to participate in the product, or somehow word of mouth driving new user acquisition, incredibly important part of a product-led business where you've got low touch, you're trying to minimize your marketing spend. This one is definitely one to keep an eye on. If you can build some kind of virality into your business, into your product experience itself, you're going to be in really good shape.